40 million people were watching. The red light above the television camera burned like a warning. The orchestra had gone completely silent. Johnny Carson sat frozen behind his desk. Dean Martin's smile slowly disappeared. And across the stage, Frank Sinatra pointed directly at Elvis Presley. Elvis didn't move. He sat beneath the brutal studio lights in a jeweled suit, surrounded by the symbols of everything America believed he had become. Fame, money, gold records, screaming fans, the crown of rock and roll. Then Sinatra leaned forward. His expression wasn't playful anymore. "You know what bothers me about you, kid?" A nervous laugh moved through the studio. Elvis gave a small smile. "No, sir." Sinatra looked him up and down. "You walk into a room dressed like a king." The laughter vanished. "You've got thousands of girls screaming your name. You've got gold records hanging on walls. You've got people telling you you're changing music." Sinatra paused, then pointed at Elvis again. "But none of that makes you a great singer." The studio froze. Johnny immediately leaned forward. "Frank." Sinatra raised one hand. "No, Johnny, let him answer." Elvis remained perfectly still. Dean Martin glanced toward him, almost expecting the younger star to fire back. He didn't. Sinatra continued. "You want to know what makes a singer?" Elvis raised his eyes. Sinatra touched his chest. "Years. Silence. Pain." Another pause. Standing in front of an audience when the fashion disappears, and finding out whether your voice is enough to keep them listening. Elvis's expression changed. Not anger. Something deeper. Sinatra leaned toward him, then delivered the question that would transform the entire night. "Take away the clothes, take away the hips, take away the screaming girls." The audience stopped breathing. Sinatra stared directly at Elvis. "What's left?" A woman in the audience covered her mouth. Johnny looked toward Elvis. This wasn't harmless television teasing anymore. Sinatra had just challenged the foundation of Elvis Presley's success in front of millions. Elvis could have attacked him. He could have listed the records, the sold-out shows, the crowds. He could have reminded Sinatra exactly who was sitting across from him. Instead, Elvis lowered his eyes and smiled. Sinatra frowned. "What are you smiling about?" Elvis slowly looked up. "Because you're right about one thing, Mr. Sinatra." The room leaned toward him. Elvis touched the jeweled collar around his neck. "Take it all away." He looked toward the studio lights. The clothes. The lights. Then toward the audience. The screaming. Finally, Elvis placed one hand over his heart. His voice became quieter. "If there's nothing left here." He paused. "Then I never deserved any of it." Nobody laughed. Even Sinatra seemed caught off guard. Johnny leaned toward Elvis. "What are you saying?" Elvis looked toward the orchestra. Then suddenly, he stood. Dean Martin sat forward. "Elvis." But Elvis was already moving. Johnny stared. "What are you doing?" Elvis stopped halfway to the stage. He turned toward Sinatra and quietly answered, "Finding out what's left." The audience exploded. Elvis immediately raised his hand. "No." The applause died. Then Elvis turned toward the orchestra. "Don't play." The bandleader stared at him. Elvis repeated himself. "No instruments." Johnny's mouth opened. Elvis looked toward the sound technicians. No effects. Now Sinatra wasn't smiling at all. Elvis walked toward the microphone. One man. One spotlight. Nothing left to hide behind. And before we hear what happened when Elvis finally opened his mouth, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. If you love powerful stories about Elvis and the legends who challenged him, like, comment, share, and subscribe, because Sinatra had just stripped away every excuse Elvis could hide behind. And what happened next would change the way everyone in that studio looked at him. Elvis wrapped his hand around the microphone. He closed his eyes. Silence. 1 second. 2. 3. No orchestra rescued him. No guitar. No drums. No screaming fans. For perhaps the first time that evening, the man standing beneath the spotlight didn't look like the king. He looked vulnerable. And somewhere beneath all that fame, Elvis remembered another version of himself. A poor boy with impossible dreams. A young man who had been told he looked strange. Moved strangely. Sang strangely. A son who had dreamed of giving his mother a better life. A performer who could hear thousands screaming his name. And still return to a silent room when the show ended. Then Elvis inhaled and began to sing. Softly, almost like a whisper. His naked voice moved through the studio. Every breath could be heard. Every tiny imperfection exposed. There was nowhere to hide. And somehow, that made it more powerful. Dean Martin stopped smiling. Johnny leaned forward with both hands against his desk. A woman in the audience began crying. Then another. Sinatra remained perfectly still. Elvis's voice grew stronger. Deeper. But he wasn't singing like a young star trying to defeat an older legend. He wasn't trying to prove Sinatra wrong. He was answering him. Take everything away. What remains? The voice trembled slightly. Elvis could have hidden the crack. He didn't. He allowed the emotion to remain. Sinatra lowered his eyes. Because suddenly he understood. Beneath the clothes, beneath the movement, beneath the screaming, there was pain, there was hunger, there was a human being, and there was a voice that didn't need anything else surrounding it. Elvis approached the final note. Johnny didn't move. Dean barely seemed to breathe. Sinatra slowly lifted his eyes. Elvis held the note. Not theatrically. Not to show off. He simply let it live in the room until there was nowhere left for the challenge to hide. Then, he released it. The sound disappeared. Silence. Not applause. Not screams. Silence. Elvis opened his eyes. He looked directly toward Frank Sinatra. Sinatra stared back. 1 second passed. Then another. Johnny looked toward the audience as though he had forgotten he was supposed to be hosting a television show. And then, Frank Sinatra stood. A gasp swept through the studio. Elvis remained beside the microphone. Sinatra began walking toward him. Slowly, deliberately. Dean Martin's expression tightened. Johnny rose halfway from his chair. Nobody knew whether Sinatra was impressed, angry, or preparing to challenge Elvis again. Sinatra stopped directly in front of him. The two legends stared at each other beneath the television lights. Elvis said nothing. Sinatra looked toward the audience, then back at Elvis. And after what felt like an eternity, Frank Sinatra finally opened his mouth. What he said next would turn a confrontation between two generations into a moment nobody in that studio would forget. Frank Sinatra stood directly in front of Elvis Presley. The studio was silent. Not quiet. Silent. 40 million people had just watched Elvis strip away the orchestra, the spectacle, and every protection fame could give him. Now Sinatra was standing only a few feet away. Johnny Carson had risen halfway from his chair. Dean Martin watched without smiling. Elvis still held the microphone. His breathing was heavy. He had answered Sinatra's challenge the only way he knew how. Not with an argument, with his voice. But nobody knew whether Sinatra believed the answer. 1 second passed. Then another. Sinatra looked toward the audience. Then back at Elvis. Finally, he spoke. Quietly. That's what's left. For half a heartbeat, nobody reacted. Then the studio exploded. People jumped to their feet. Applause crashed through the room. Dean Martin began clapping. Johnny Carson shook his head in disbelief. But Elvis didn't celebrate. He simply stood there looking at Sinatra. Because he could see something in the older man's face. Sinatra wasn't finished. Frank raised one hand. Slowly, the applause faded. He stepped closer to Elvis. I pushed you for a reason. Elvis listened. I've watched fame destroy talented men. The mood changed again. I've watched applause convince people they're immortal. Sinatra looked toward the audience. Then back at Elvis. And I've watched good singers stop listening to themselves because everybody around them kept telling them they were great. Elvis lowered the microphone. Sinatra pointed toward his chest. I wanted to know whether you believed the noise. His finger moved toward Elvis. Or whether you still knew where the music came from. Elvis's expression softened. Suddenly, the confrontation looked different. Sinatra hadn't simply been attacking the young star. He had been testing something. Something fame had taken from countless performers before him. Perspective. Elvis nodded slowly. Sinatra extended his hand. You answered me. Elvis stared at the hand. The entire studio waited. Then Elvis reached forward. Their hands met. Applause began again. But before Sinatra could turn away, Elvis pulled him closer. The audience gasped. Not aggressively. Elvis leaned toward him, almost like a younger man, speaking privately to someone he deeply respected. Then he said, You didn't insult me. Sinatra looked genuinely surprised. Elvis continued. You reminded me of something I never want to forget. Sinatra's eyes narrowed. What? Elvis slowly looked around the studio. The cameras. The enormous lights. The audience. The orchestra. Then down at his own jeweled clothing. All of this can disappear. Nobody moved. The records can disappear. Elvis touched the collar of his suit. The clothes can disappear. He looked toward the crowd. The screaming can stop. Then he placed his hand over his heart. But if the reason you started is still here. He paused. You haven't lost everything. Sinatra stared at him. The hardness in his expression disappeared. Johnny Carson slowly stood completely upright. Dean Martin joined him. Then Sinatra did something nobody expected. He placed one arm around Elvis's shoulder. Minutes earlier, they had looked like two men separated by an entire generation. Now they stood together beneath the same spotlight. Johnny looked at them. Frank. Sinatra turned. After hearing that, do you still think Elvis has something to prove? A nervous laugh moved through the audience. Sinatra looked at Elvis. Elvis raised an eyebrow. Then Frank answered, "Yes." The room gasped. Elvis suddenly laughed. Dean Martin's mouth fell open. Johnny stared at Sinatra. But Frank wasn't smiling. Then he added, "So do I." That silenced everyone. Sinatra looked toward the audience. So does every artist who wakes up tomorrow. Elvis's smile faded. He listened. Sinatra continued, "You don't get to sing well tonight and own tomorrow." He glanced toward Elvis. "You don't get to sell 1,000,000 records and decide you've arrived." Then came the sentence Elvis would remember. Yesterday's applause doesn't sing today's song. Elvis slowly nodded. Something about those words reached him. Because he understood exactly what Sinatra meant. Every performance began again at zero. Every audience was another test. Every song demanded honesty. A crown could tell the world what you had done yesterday. It couldn't sing for you tomorrow. Johnny looked between the two men. The tension had broken. So naturally, he asked the question everyone at home was probably thinking. "All right." He smiled. "So who's the better singer?" The audience burst into laughter. Dean Martin leaned back, delighted. "Oh, now we're getting somewhere." Sinatra looked at Elvis. Elvis looked at Sinatra. For a moment, the younger man seemed ready to make a joke. Then his expression became serious. "That's the wrong question." Johnny raised an eyebrow. "The wrong question." "Yes, sir." Johnny leaned forward. "Then what's the right one?" Elvis looked toward the audience. Some people were still wiping tears from their faces. He looked toward Sinatra. Then answered, "Did we make somebody feel something?" The laughter disappeared. Elvis continued, "If somebody sitting at home forgot their troubles for a few minutes." He glanced toward the microphone. "If somebody heard a song and remembered someone they loved." His voice softened. "If somebody who felt alone suddenly didn't." Elvis looked directly at Sinatra. "Then tonight, we both did our job." Sinatra stared at him, then smiled, and began applauding. Dean joined him. Johnny followed. Within seconds, the entire studio was standing. The applause became thunderous. But Elvis wasn't smiling because he had defeated Frank Sinatra. And Sinatra wasn't applauding because he had surrendered. Something much more unusual had happened. Two generations had collided. One legend had challenged another. Everything was there for the moment to become ugly. Pride. Competition. Millions of viewers. Two enormous reputations. One careless sentence could have created a feud people would talk about for years. Instead, respect had emerged. Sinatra had reminded Elvis that fame was temporary. Elvis had reminded Sinatra that music didn't belong to only one generation. And millions watching at home had witnessed something rarer than talent. Two powerful men challenging each other without needing to destroy each other. As the applause continued, Sinatra leaned toward Elvis. "Kid." Elvis turned. Frank's expression was no longer challenging. It was almost fatherly. "Never let them convince you the crown is more important than the man wearing it." Elvis looked down. For several seconds, he didn't answer. Then he glanced toward the audience. The people who bought the records. The people who waited outside theaters. the people who had turned a poor boy from Mississippi into one of the most recognizable men alive. Elvis looked back at Sinatra and never let the man wearing it forget who gave him the chance to wear it. He pointed toward the audience. Sinatra followed his hand, then slowly nodded. Johnny returned toward his desk. Dean Martin sat down again. Sinatra and Elvis began walking back toward their seats. It appeared the confrontation was over. But Elvis stopped. Sinatra noticed. "What is it?" Elvis looked toward the microphone he had just used. Then toward Frank. "There is one thing I want to know." The audience quieted again. Sinatra smiled cautiously. "What's that?" Elvis took a step closer. "When you asked me what would be left if everything disappeared." He paused. "Were you asking me?" Sinatra frowned. Elvis's eyes remained fixed on him. "Or were you asking yourself?" Frank Sinatra's smile vanished. Dean Martin immediately looked toward him. Johnny stopped moving. For the first time all night, Sinatra had no immediate answer. Elvis hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't meant it as revenge. But somehow, the question struck the older legend harder than any insult could have. Because Elvis had realized something. A man doesn't usually ask another person what remains when fame disappears, unless he has wondered the same thing about himself. Sinatra stared at Elvis. The studio became silent again. Then Frank slowly looked toward the empty microphone. And when he finally answered, the entire conversation would become more personal than anyone watching had expected. Frank Sinatra didn't answer. For the first time that night, the man who had challenged Elvis Presley in front of millions seemed completely unprepared. Elvis stood only a few feet away. His question remained suspended between them. "When you asked me what would be left if everything disappeared, were you asking me?" Elvis paused. "Or were you asking yourself?" Dean Martin stopped smiling. Johnny Carson slowly returned his hands to the desk. The audience waited. Sinatra looked toward Elvis, then toward the microphone. Finally, he gave a quiet laugh. Not the confident laugh from earlier. This one sounded different. Older. Tired. "That's a dangerous question, kid." Elvis smiled faintly. "You asked me one first." A few people laughed nervously. Sinatra nodded. "Fair enough." Then he walked toward his chair. But he didn't sit. Instead, he rested one hand against the back of it and stared toward the darkened edge of the studio. "When you've been doing this long enough," he paused, "you start noticing something." Elvis listened. The applause always sounds permanent while it's happening. Sinatra looked toward the audience. But eventually, the room empties. Silence. The lights go off. His voice softened. The people go home. Then Sinatra looked directly at Elvis. "And if you've built your entire identity around hearing them scream your name, the silence afterward can become terrifying." Elvis's expression changed. Because he understood. More than Sinatra probably realized. Elvis had known rooms filled with screaming fans. And he had known what came afterwards. Hotel doors closing. Hallways becoming quiet. A mirror. A chair. A man left alone with himself. Sinatra continued. "So yes." He nodded slowly. "Maybe I was asking myself too." No one laughed. The confrontation had disappeared. This was no longer Frank Sinatra versus Elvis Presley. It was two famous men speaking about the thing fame rarely allowed them to admit. Someday the noise stops, and then you discover whether there was ever anything underneath it. Elvis walked closer. What did you find? Sinatra looked at him. When the room got quiet, Frank smiled sadly. Some nights. He paused. I didn't like what I found. The audience became motionless. Sinatra wasn't performing now. He was confessing. I've made mistakes. He glanced toward Dean Martin. I've let pride speak when I should have kept my mouth shut. Dean gave him a knowing smile. Sinatra continued. I've thought being respected meant never allowing anyone to challenge me. Then he looked back at Elvis. But age teaches you something fame doesn't. Elvis waited. Sinatra said quietly, being the biggest man in the room doesn't mean anything if your ego makes everybody else feel small. Elvis lowered his eyes. Those words hit him. Because only minutes earlier, Elvis had possessed the perfect opportunity to humiliate Sinatra. He could have taken the applause, taken the victory, made the older legend regret ever challenging him. Instead, Elvis had refused. That refusal was now changing the entire conversation. Sinatra stepped toward him. You know what surprised me? What? You didn't try to beat me. Elvis frowned. Sinatra pointed toward the microphone. You could have walked over there angry. He shook his head. You could have sung like you wanted to bury me. A faint smile appeared. But you didn't. Elvis looked toward the stage. I wasn't singing to you. I know. Sinatra nodded. That's why it worked. The words settled over the studio. Because Sinatra finally understood what had happened. Elvis had stopped trying to win. And the moment he stopped trying to win, he had shown everyone exactly who he was. The challenge had begun with Sinatra asking what remained when everything surrounding Elvis disappeared. The answer had never been a costume, or a record, or a crown. It had been the man beneath them. Johnny Carson finally spoke. You two realize we're still doing a television show, right? The audience burst into laughter. Even Sinatra laughed. Elvis turned toward Johnny. Sorry, sir. Dean Martin leaned forward. No, keep going. This is the first time Frank's admitted he might be wrong since 1947. The audience roared. Sinatra pointed at Dean. Careful. Dean raised both hands. There he is. Elvis laughed. For the first time that evening, the tension broke completely. But beneath the laughter, something had shifted permanently. Sinatra returned to his chair. Elvis sat beside him. Johnny looked from one legend to the other. All right. He adjusted the papers on his desk. Let me ask something serious. Dean sighed dramatically. Oh no. Johnny ignored him. He looked at Sinatra. Frank, when you first looked at Elvis tonight, what did you see? Sinatra didn't answer immediately. A phenomenon. Elvis raised an eyebrow. Sinatra continued. A young man surrounded by more noise than most people experience in a lifetime. Johnny nodded. And now, Sinatra turned toward Elvis. The studio quieted. Now, he smiled. I see a singer. Elvis lowered his head. The audience applauded. But Sinatra raised his hand. And I see something more dangerous. Elvis looked back up. Dean grinned. This should be good. Sinatra's expression became serious. I see somebody young enough to still believe he has time. Elvis stopped smiling. Frank leaned toward him. Don't waste it. Silence. Don't spend your life trying to convince people you're Elvis Presley. He pointed toward Elvis's chest. You already know who you are. Then toward the audience. Give them the music. Elvis stared at him. Frank continued. Because one day you'll look around and realize the years moved faster than you thought. The studio became unusually quiet. Elvis nodded. Yes, sir. Sinatra shook his head. Don't yes, sir me. A few people laughed. Remember it. Elvis smiled. I will. Frank studied him. Then said, good, because yesterday's applause doesn't sing today's song. Elvis repeated the sentence softly. Yesterday's applause. Johnny heard him. That got you, didn't it? Elvis nodded. It did. Why? Elvis looked toward the audience. Because sometimes people start believing what happened yesterday guarantees tomorrow. He glanced at Sinatra. It doesn't. Then Elvis looked toward the microphone. You have to walk out there again. Another pause. And mean it again. Sinatra smiled. Now you're learning. Elvis laughed. Dean interrupted. Can we stop teaching Elvis things? He's making the rest of us look lazy. The audience laughed again. Then Johnny asked the question that would define the evening. Elvis, after all this. He gestured between the two singers. Who's better? Elvis smiled. Sinatra leaned back. Dean waited eagerly. Elvis could have escaped with a joke. Instead, he became serious. That's the wrong question. Johnny frowned. Then what's the right question? Elvis looked around the studio. His eyes passed over the orchestra that had remained silent during his performance. The audience. The cameras. Then Sinatra. Finally, Elvis answered. Did we make somebody feel something? The room went quiet. If somebody heard us tonight and remembered someone they love. Elvis paused. If somebody forgot their troubles for a few minutes. His voice softened. If somebody sitting alone somewhere suddenly felt a little less alone. He looked toward Sinatra. Then tonight, we both did our job. Sinatra stared at him. Then began clapping. Dean joined him. Johnny stood. Within seconds, the audience rose. A thunderous standing ovation filled the studio. Elvis remained seated for a moment, almost embarrassed. Sinatra leaned toward him. Stand up, kid. Elvis shook his head. They're applauding both of us. Frank smiled. Exactly. The two men stood together. 2 generations. 2 different styles. 2 enormous reputations. Neither had destroyed the other. Neither needed to. The applause grew louder. Then Sinatra placed his arm around Elvis's shoulder and leaned toward him. His next words were almost swallowed by the crowd. But Elvis heard them. Never let them convince you the crown is more important than the man wearing it. Elvis's smile disappeared. He looked down at his jeweled suit. Then toward the audience. He seemed to think carefully before answering. Finally, Elvis leaned toward Sinatra. And never let the man wearing it forget who gave him the chance to wear it. He pointed toward the crowd. Sinatra slowly nodded. But as the cameras began pulling back and Johnny prepared to move the broadcast forward, Sinatra suddenly tightened his hand on Elvis's shoulder. Kid. Elvis turned. Frank's face had become serious again. There was one final thing he wanted to say. something he hadn't intended to say on television, something far more personal than the challenge that had started the night. Elvis leaned closer. Sinatra whispered only a few words. And the instant Elvis heard them, his expression changed completely. Because Frank Sinatra wasn't talking about music anymore. He was warning Elvis about fame itself. Sinatra's hand remained on Elvis Presley's shoulder. The applause was still rolling through the studio, but Frank leaned closer until only Elvis could clearly hear him. His expression had changed. No challenge, no competition, no television smile. Just warning. Be careful when everybody starts telling you that you can do no wrong. Elvis stopped smiling. Sinatra continued quietly. That's when a man becomes most capable of destroying himself. Elvis stared at him. The words landed differently from everything Frank had said before. Sinatra looked toward the applauding audience. They love you tonight. Then toward the cameras. They'll follow you tonight. His voice dropped. But fame has a cruel habit, kid. Elvis waited. It makes you believe the noise belongs to you. Sinatra removed his hand from Elvis's shoulder. It doesn't. Elvis looked toward the audience. Thousands of eyes seemed fixed on him. Frank continued. It belongs to the moment. Silence. And moments end. Elvis slowly nodded. Sinatra had already warned him never to value the crown more than the man wearing it. Now Elvis understood what the warning really meant. If he ever confused applause with identity, then the day the applause disappeared, he might believe he had disappeared with it. Elvis looked down at his jeweled clothing, then back at Frank. So what do you hold on to? Sinatra studied him. The reason you started. Elvis's eyes narrowed slightly. Frank pointed toward his chest. Before the money. Another pause. Before the headlines. Before anybody cared who you were. Sinatra smiled faintly. That kid. Elvis lowered his eyes. He could almost see him. A poor boy with nervous hands. A boy listening to music and dreaming about a world impossibly larger than the one around him. Before anyone called him the king. Before the screaming. Before the gates. Before every room changed the moment he entered. That boy hadn't wanted a crown. He had wanted to sing. Johnny Carson watched the two men. Something tells me you two are having a better conversation than the rest of us. The audience laughed. Elvis looked toward Johnny. Mr. Sinatra is trying to keep me out of trouble. Dean Martin immediately leaned forward. Frank. He pointed at Sinatra. Frank Sinatra is giving advice about staying out of trouble. The audience exploded. Sinatra stared at Dean. Keep talking. Dean raised his hands. I withdraw the question. Even Elvis laughed. The tension finally dissolved. But Frank's warning remained inside him. Johnny returned to his desk. All right, gentlemen. He looked toward Elvis. We started tonight with Frank asking what remains if you take everything away. Elvis nodded. Johnny turned toward Sinatra. And somehow we ended up discussing life. Dean sighed. This is why I drink. Another burst of laughter. Johnny smiled. But before we move on, I want one final answer. He looked toward Elvis. Do you think Frank was wrong to challenge you? Elvis immediately shook his head. No, sir. Sinatra glanced at him. Johnny seemed surprised. Not even a little. Elvis looked toward Frank. He could have said it nicer. The audience roared. Sinatra laughed. Elvis smiled, then became serious. But no. He looked toward the microphone where he had stood alone. I think sometimes somebody has to ask you the question you don't want to hear. The studio quieted. Elvis continued. And if your answer is real. He paused. You shouldn't be afraid of the question. Sinatra slowly nodded. Elvis turned toward him. You didn't take anything away from me tonight. Frank listened. You reminded me to check whether it was still there. Sinatra smiled. That'll do. Then Johnny turned toward Frank. And Elvis. Sinatra raised an eyebrow. Was he wrong to challenge you back? Frank looked at Elvis. A long pause followed. Finally, no. Dean leaned forward dramatically. Could somebody record that? The audience laughed. Sinatra ignored him. He asked me whether I was really talking about myself. Frank's expression softened. He was right. Elvis watched him. That's the thing about getting older. Sinatra looked toward the audience. You spend years believing you're teaching younger men. He smiled. Then one of them reminds you that you're still learning too. Elvis lowered his head respectfully. There was no winner anymore. That was what made the moment powerful. The night had begun as a collision. Older America against younger America. Traditional entertainment against rock and roll. One generation suspicious of the next. But the confrontation had become something else. Two artists forcing each other to remember why they had entered music in the first place. The original challenge had been brutally simple. Take away the clothes, take away the hips, take away the screaming girls, what's left? Elvis had answered without defending his sales or his fame. He had walked toward a microphone and removed everything he could hide behind. And Sinatra had eventually given the answer himself. That's what's left. A voice, a heart, a man. Johnny looked toward both performers. One more question. Dean groaned. Johnny laughed. This one's easy. He looked at Elvis. Who's the better singer? The audience immediately began laughing. Elvis looked at Sinatra. Sinatra looked back. Frank shrugged. Go ahead, kid. Elvis smiled, then shook his head. That's still the wrong question. Johnny leaned back. I walked into that one. Elvis continued. The question is whether somebody felt something. The room quieted. If we made somebody remember someone they love. Elvis looked toward the audience. If somebody sitting alone at home heard a song and didn't feel quite so alone. Then toward Sinatra. Then we both did our job. Frank began applauding. Dean joined him. Johnny stood. Then row after row of audience members rose. The applause became deafening. But this time, Elvis didn't stand alone beneath the spotlight. Sinatra walked beside him. Two men. Two generations. Shoulder to shoulder. Frank raised Elvis's hand for a moment. The crowd erupted even louder. Elvis immediately shook his head, laughing. Then he grabbed Sinatra's wrist and raised Frank's hand too. The gesture changed everything. Neither man would accept the role of victor. Johnny watched them with a smile. Dean stood applauding. The cameras moved closer. Millions watching at home saw an image few would have expected at the beginning of the night. Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley standing together. Not enemies. not rivals. Artists. Sinatra leaned toward Elvis. Remember what I told you? Elvis nodded. The crown. Frank smiled. The man underneath it. Elvis looked toward the audience, then answered with the thought that had struck him earlier. And the man wearing it should never forget who gave him the chance to wear it. He gestured toward the crowd. Sinatra nodded. The cameras slowly began pulling back. Johnny returned to his desk. Dean Martin settled into his chair. Frank sat beside Elvis. And somehow, a confrontation that could have become one of the ugliest moments of the broadcast ended with two legends sitting shoulder to shoulder. But Johnny noticed something. Elvis was still looking toward the microphone. "What are you thinking about?" Elvis turned. For a second, he seemed reluctant to answer. Then he smiled. "I'm thinking Mr. Sinatra was right." Frank looked surprised. "Don't say that too loudly." The audience laughed. Elvis continued. "All this can disappear." He gestured toward the studio. "The records, the clothes, the crowds." His smile faded. "Everything." Johnny waited. Elvis placed one hand over his heart. "So you'd better make sure the part that made you start doesn't disappear with it." Sinatra stared at him, then quietly applauded once. Dean followed. The audience rose again. Elvis looked embarrassed, but Frank leaned closer. "Take it, kid." Elvis shook his head. "No." Sinatra frowned. Elvis smiled. "We take it." Frank's expression softened. They stood together. And perhaps that was the real answer to everything that had happened. Greatness wasn't winning the argument. It wasn't protecting the title of king. It wasn't forcing another legend to admit defeat. True greatness was having every reason to answer pride with pride, and choosing character instead. The final image wasn't Elvis standing over Sinatra. It wasn't Sinatra putting Elvis in his place. It was respect. Frank looking toward Elvis without condescension. Elvis looking back without resentment. Two legends. Two generations. One stage. And one lesson that remained after the applause faded. When someone questions your greatness, don't tell them who you are. Show them. And when you've shown them, have enough humility not to make them feel small.